Zebulon, a popular bar and venue in Los Angeles, regularly throws parties with DJ sets and themes. I was in LA this past month and my friends and I went to the Dodgers game, and we were looking for something to do after, so when we walked into Zebulon, we stumbled into something called Indie Sleaze Night. As the DJ rattled off songs, almost every single one made us stop and ask each other, is this Indie Sleaze? It's not like all the songs sounded the same or anything. MIA's Paper Planes was next to songs from the first two Strokes albums, followed up by 212 by Azalea Banks, and then songs from Charlie XCX's new album Brat. Spotify has an official editorial playlist called Indie Sleaze, and sure enough, all of these songs are on there. Sounds like the DJ at Zebulon was kinda lazy. Now you might be asking me, hey HADJI, what the hell is Indie Sleaze? Because maybe you're not chronically online enough to have already come across this term. And you wouldn't be alone in that. If you jumped into a time machine and went to one of the first Stroke shows in the 2000s, and you asked the people in the audience, what genre is this? Exactly 0 people would have called it Indie Sleaze. That's because the first real documented use of the term came in 2021, when a 30-year-old blogger named Olivia started an Instagram account called Indie Sleaze. And on there, she would post throwback images of bands and parties from the early 2000s all the way through the early to mid 2010s. Olivia has said in some interviews that I could find that I don't think she ever really intended for the phrase Indie Sleaze to become as ubiquitous as it has become. But for the rest of the world, it became a pretty convenient way to describe a particular vibe. A sound, a dress code, or lack thereof, a style of photography, certain books, movies, and TV shows, and so much more. Much has already been said about Indie Sleaze, from people trying to just define what the hell it is, to arguing about whether it's really back or if it's already over, to lamenting the fact that certain communities and people are often erased from the narrative around it. And there have already been plenty of people on YouTube who have done an excellent job covering Indie Sleaze. My personal favorite video on it is from Karsten Kroning, and I'm going to link his video in the description. But what I want to talk about today is Indie Sleaze, particularly as a genre of music. Are there guidelines that define what makes a song or even an artist Indie Sleaze? Is it in the music itself? Is it in the lyrics? Is it about how the artists lived, where they lived, how they dressed? And what does it say about us as fans and as listeners, and the value of categorizing things into these subgenres that we basically are creating on the fly? But before we get into all that, if you like videos like this on music, I'd really appreciate a like and subscribe. I post one every week, and if you want to see them early, go to my Instagram, HADJI Gaviota, throw me a follow, and join my broadcast channel. I post the links to all my videos one day early in the broadcast channel. Also want to say thank you to all you guys who have checked out my latest song, Tricky. If you like the instrumental playing in the background, it's that, should give you an idea. I'll throw the link to the video in the description. And also, I'm shooting the video for the next song this week, so stay tuned for that. Let's get back to the video. It's hard to define exactly what the parameters for the genre of Indie Sleaze are. Most of the people who use the term would define it as beginning with the rise of New York-based bands like The Strokes, LCD Sound System, and the Yeah Yeah Yeahs at the turn of the millennium, give and take the year 2000. But much like how today's acts that get classified with the Indie Sleaze sticker, like The Dare or The Help, are inspired by what came before them, The Strokes, for example, were heavily influenced by an era of New York rock bands from the 60s to the 80s, with artists like the Velvet Underground, Television, and the Ramones. It's kind of off topic, but I think it's a nice reminder that, well, we like to think of our generation now as being like super nostalgic, and part of that is true because we have access to see everything that came before us at our phones at all times. It's important to remember that we weren't the first generation to want to look back to try to find something or find some inspiration. The book Meet Me in the Bathroom by Lizzie Goodman does an excellent job of talking about what this time period was like for rock bands in New York. I highly recommend reading this book, and also Please Kill Me. That's not like a demand, that's like the name of another book, by Legs McNeil and Gillian McCain. That book does kind of the same thing that Meet Me in the Bathroom does, except for that earlier group of bands like the Velvet Underground and Television. It's one of my favorite books of all time. Highly recommend reading it. But yeah, so there was a very cohesive and particular vibe in music at the time that the book Meet Me in the Bathroom is trying to cover. And it would be sensible if someone wanted to take all of those artists and put them under one umbrella. But when we think about the first era of Indie Sleaze, it's not just talking about those bands. Like going back to what they played at Zebulon, you have these more electronic artists like Crystal Castles or even MGMT, and also artists who weren't necessarily tied to the New York scene. And then you have artists that aren't bands at all, like Kid Cudi, Azalea Banks, MIA, Santigold, all of these artists that are like super indie sleaze. When you think of indie sleaze, like they're totally different from that era of the Strokes. So how do we put them all together? Is there musical DNA that connects these acts beyond just a nostalgia for alternative music from the 2000s to the 2010s? At first glance, it's not particularly obvious. We'll look at it a little bit later in the video, but for now, we can talk about the one thing that did connect all of those artists, and that's their listenership, or at least a particular section of it. You see, all of the artists that I've mentioned so far were able to use the internet, or what the internet looked like in the 2000s, to propel themselves to stardom. The rise of blogs and magazines like The Fader, Dazed and Confused, Pitchfork, and then a little later on, Complex and Pigeons and Planes. That was how people were finding music. And the same kid surfing one of those blogs in 2008 could have found the debut MGMT album, but also found Day and Night by Kid Cudi. And then they would have saved them into their iTunes library and listened to them right next to each other. And they were probably running that iTunes like the Navy, with a very particular system for naming songs and all that. I know I was doing that as a kid. That's kind of a dying art, but yeah. And on a larger level, a lot of this music could have been bunched together and dismissed as what someone would call hipster music, with its listeners called the H word as well. That word can describe a certain kind of person, probably living in a city, the kind of person who was like, oh, I was listening to them before they were cool. They probably dressed a certain way, and it wasn't something that people would necessarily wear as a badge of honor. As an article from The Onion in 2006 perfectly encapsulates, two hipsters angrily call each other hipster. People had totally different definitions of what the word hipster meant, but everybody involved knew that they did not want to be called it. An article from New York Magazine in 2010 called What Was the Hipster? Tried its best to answer the question, what actually does this word mean? They painted a picture of a culture of aspiring artists who worked day jobs in bars and coffee shops, who then rubbed up against a new class of rich young people who would go into the neighborhoods that these establishments were in, looking to spend all of their newly earned money on things that they deemed culturally cool. I'm gonna stop myself before I fall down like too big of a sociological rabbit hole, but my point is, while the word indie sleaze would have never been used to describe these cultures, I think there is a lens to look at the current indie sleaze movement as a revival of that hipster subculture of the 2000s and 2010s. The word hipster kind of lost all meaning, like once American Apparel closed and streaming services started to eat into the utility of those like music discovery blogs. When Daisy Jones wrote about the hipster for Vice in 2023, in their article 20 Years On, The Rise and Fall of the Hipster, she made the same connection. Or maybe the hipster now exists among the hyper online. TikTok-pilled users making core videos, music nerds gathering on the Frost Children Discord, your ex-boyfriend running a post-ironic anti-establishment meme page. The modern indie sleaze movement does feel like sort of a hyper-online version of the hipster era. Although when people say that, I think it's important to remember that hipsters back then were hyper-online as well. It just looked a lot different to be hyper-online in 2006 or in 2013 than it does in 2024. Before like short-form video content was blasting our brains to absolute bits. In short, it's not a perfect one-to-one comparison, but I do think that the current indie sleaze revival shares a lineage with the hipster of the past. So a lot of people might say, well, if we didn't call it indie sleaze then why are we calling it indie sleaze now? But I gotta ask, why does it matter if we didn't call it that then? Our perspectives change over time. Nobody called it World War I when it was happening. It took World War II for them to say, hey, maybe we can call that one World War I, right? Things change. And we gain new perspectives every day looking back on the past. And we find new angles and lenses to look at them from. And when we think about something like a genre of music, it might be easier to categorize it once we're away from it actually happening. Words are still very important though, so I think we need to take a look at the phrase indie sleaze and really break down what it means. Indie is a word that at one point meant independent, but in modern times, its sense evolved to describe like a group of subgenres. Indie rock, indie pop, indie folk, indie electronic, just to name a few. Using the old definition of the word indie, some of the modern indie sleaze acts would be disqualified. For example, The Dare is signed to Republic Records and The Help are signed to Atlantic Records. However, most people don't use the word indie to mean that anymore. Instead, it's kind of like a DIY aesthetic, a zag when other people zig, a rejection of that like super created by the industry kind of artist. It's an aesthetic of doing things your own way, even if maybe that's not really the case in the studio. So it's fine. I mean, figuring out what the hell the word indie means in 2024 is probably its own video, and if that's something you want to see, let me know in the comments. But I think it would be more interesting to look at the word sleaze, because I think that's the real modifier here. Sleaze comes from the adjective sleazy, and if we look at what that means in the Oxford Dictionary, it means sordid, corrupt, immoral, or squalid or seedy if you're talking about a place instead of a person. It has a generally negative connotation, one of dirt and cheapness. But when used to describe an intentional aesthetic, it kind of reclaims it and takes the negativity out of it. It becomes a term of endearment, an acknowledgement of the who cares aesthetic that once was dominated by flash photography at these parties where people dressed like there weren't going to be paparazzi there or there weren't going to be Instagram photo dumps. And someone might have even spilled something on their shirt, but it would just look cool because they, were c'est la vie and all that. Musically, though, more specifically, the term can kind of align with the garage guitar tones of the Strokes, or also the earwormy, anthemic kind of synths that you would get in the later half of the first indie sleaze era. Lyrically, there's content about partying and sex and being a broke artist in a city just trying to make it work. All of that lends to this generally sleazy vibe. So getting back to the actual music, when we listen to modern artists like The Dare, you can hear a lineage that pretty clearly goes back to artists like LCD Sound System. When you listen to other current artists like Frost Children or Snow Strippers, or maybe even like Two Hollis, you can draw a line to some of the electronic music from the later 2000s that tends to get bunched in with the indie sleaze bag. But again, it's harder to find the common ground between those artists that I just named and the Strokes. But nobody would deny that both of those things are indie sleaze. At the same time, there are artists who are categorically, definitely not indie sleaze artists at a grand scale. But if you ask me, and maybe it's a hot take, they have songs that belong in the indie sleaze universe. There was a period where Kanye West was making stuff that I would argue was kind of indie sleaze. I think the best example is his song with Estelle, American Boy. It's got that funky will.i.am produced beat. Drake. Yes, Drake.
Drake? Drake?
Another artist you would probably never associate with the word indie sleaze on its own has songs that are like 100% indie sleaze to me. Drake has had so many eras that sometimes it's hard to remember when he was the hipster heartthrob, when you see him today as like the British Jamaican mob boss. But he had lines about how hard it was going to be for the hipsters and the hood dudes to get along at his shows. So Far Gone has multiple moments that fit right in with the indie sleaze movement, to me. Let's Call It Off samples a Peter, Bjorn, and John song, which I don't know if sleaze is the right word, but that song is so indie, and it would fit like right in the Urban Outfitters playlist next to a bunch of the stuff that we've already talked about. And when I hear that song come on, I feel like a craft beer come flying into my hand like Thor's mallet. And then you've got Unstoppable with Santa Gold and Lil Wayne, which Santa Gold makes everything sound like an indie sleaze song. But with that like la 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 la, like that shit is indie sleaze. And at the time, the listenership of So Far Gone, like yes, it was rap fans, but it was also like Urban Outfitters kids, 100%, and Vice employees. If we want to decide whether indie sleaze is a genre or not, we need to understand the definition of genre. When I was still pretty new to this YouTube thing, I did a video called Genre Doesn't Mean Anything Anymore, where I went a little bit deeper into like the origins and the concepts of what makes something a genre, but for the sake of this video, I think I'm going to keep it a little bit simpler. We're going to go back to our friends at Oxford Dictionary, who say that a genre is a category of artistic composition, as in music or literature, characterized by similarities in form, style, or subject matter. Wikipedia gets their definition of the word from an academic writing book called Keywords in Writing Studies, and says that genre is any style or form of communication in any mode with socially agreed upon conventions developed over time. I wanted to talk about that definition too because I think that last part is really important. The only thing that really matters when defining a genre is if we, the people, are like, okay, yeah, that fits in this genre. And the conventions developing over time part I think is really important too. Because like we talked about, the phrase indie sleaze didn't exist when this music was coming out, but that doesn't mean it's inaccurate. Over time, we were able to look back at it and be like, hey, I think we can group these things together because of other social contexts. So, have we agreed upon the conventions of what makes something indie sleaze? Based on everything we've talked about so far, some of the key aspects are an association with a particular time period, be it the early 2000s garage rock in New York to the early 2010s like electronic stuff, or the revival period that we're seeing now. There's a connection to New York and a general like downtown party scene vibe. And then there's strong roots in fashion, but mixed with a highly internet literate culture. And then you're gonna get the lyrics about partying, about being a dirtbag, not caring what other people think. You know what I'm saying. So let's look back at those Kanye and Drake songs that I picked out. American Boy, obviously super anthemic in its production and the chorus. I think Estelle's vocal tone also Very indie sleaze. And then it's got a bunch of lyrics about being out in New York and partying. And then you get the Kanye part where he's talking about fashion. I think that song is totally indie sleaze. Drake's Unstoppable, like, because of the Santigold sample, is like always gonna sound indie sleaze. But even when we look at some of his lyrics, and I fall in love with girls caught up in superficial glamour who dress like Sarah Jessica and live like Princess Diana. I think I've heard that song so many times that I can't like not kind of rap it. You get a particularly New York vibe, especially given the Sarah Jessica Parker reference, because girls who are dressing like Sarah Jessica, she's best known for being the character in Sex and the City, which is like all about these like New York City girls. So it's a very particular kind of person, and it fits in that indie sleaze concept. Santigold herself has a song called Les Artistes, which is about moving to New York to chase your dreams of being an artist. For those who aren't as versed in New York stuff, LES stands for the Lower East Side. It's a neighborhood in Manhattan that a lot of, the Strokes stuff that we were talking about in the early 2000s happened there. It's got a lot of culture, or at least it did. Still does, I think, to me. You also might know it from Childish Gambino's song LES, which also might be indie sleaze. So these Kanye and Drake songs don't really have that much to do with each other even, but I think they both could be given the indie sleaze tag. That's because genres aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. Something can fit into more than one genre at once, just depending on what angle you're looking at it from. Like American Boy is a pop song, and part of it is a rap song, but it's also an indie sleaze song if we consider the context and some of the things that make it what it is. You can say the same thing for the Drake songs as well. But now, let's try to get to the fun part. What do these artists being called indie sleaze think about the term indie sleaze? I don't think I can get Kanye, Drake, or Julian Casablancas from The Strokes to get on here and talk to me, but I am lucky enough to know at least 2 artists who are on Spotify's official indie sleaze playlist. So I reached out to them and I asked them what they thought about it. First up is Shades of Blue. Shades of Blue is an LA-based indie rock artist. We've done some shows together. We've got some music together unreleased. Super talented guy, makes really cool music. His song It is on the indie sleaze playlist, so I asked him, what do you think of that? And he said, I think they categorized that song really well. That genre was exactly what I was going for with that song, LOL. So that led me to the next question. What does that genre mean to you? And he said, it's kind of like dance music with live instrumentation, has a less processed feel to me. At least that's what the older bands like LCD Sound System in that genre felt like to me. The genre now feels a little more like experimental dance music, which is cool too. It also seems to get mixed up with a lot of indie rock from that time, but I don't really know. I do think the genre is supposed to represent more of a time period rather than a specific genre of music. It's New York in the early to mid 2000s and the style from that time. I guess if the music you make feels like that, then it's indie sleaze. That's a good answer, man. And so for Shades of Blue, who is not from New York, doesn't live in New York, but he's got a particular sound and vibe that kind of fits in the world. And when you listen to the song It in particular, with the funky bass line, the little high-pitched vocal parts, the weird synths, like it totally fits in that world, so it makes sense. Another artist friend of mine, Swami Sound, has his song Refuse on the indie sleaze playlist. Swami is a DJ, artist, and producer from the Bronx, and he makes a really cool genre of music that he calls NYC Garage. It's night and day compared to Shades of Blue's It, and yet they're both on the same Spotify editorial playlist. And that's okay with me by the definitions that we've been working with so far. But how does Swami feel about it? I asked him, and he said, well, I think the heart of indie sleaze's first incarnation lies within New York City's up-and-coming indie scene. And you could more or less say that I am a part of it. It's simple, really. That's true, and to me, you can't really talk about New York City's up-and-coming music scene without talking about Swami Sound. Some of the most fun that I've had has been at the shows that he's been throwing in New York over the last 2 or 3 years. If indie sleaze is a tag that's supposed to represent a place, then you really can't do it without Swami. And who cares if it doesn't sound like The Strokes or Frost Children? It can still be indie sleaze. And hey, indie sleaze is not the only genre that can be hard to define with very specific parameters. We all think we know what a rap song sounds like, but I just went and listened to Rakim's Guess Who's Back and then Lil Baby and 42 Doug's We Paid. And nobody can tell me neither of those are rap songs, but they don't really sound very much like each other. Things change, things evolve, and the ways that we classify genres is going to change as well. We can do this with rock music, with like Led Zeppelin and Nickelback. There's no way you can tell me neither of those aren't rock music, but at the same time, they don't sound very similar to each other. Or we can do this with R&B. If I asked someone to name an R&B song, and they said Sitting on the Dock of the Bay by Otis Redding, but then another person said Don't by Bryson Tiller, neither of them are wrong, but their answers are totally different. But that's okay. The point is, genre is a fascinating thing. And it's more fun to me when it's not super rigid. We can use it to analyze culture and really break down why we love the things that we love so much. Or we can get online and just argue about them all day. That's fine with me too. But thinking about indie sleaze and, witnessing this revival, and then also this reclassification of a lot of music that I grew up loving, it made me really want to pick apart and think about why we categorize music the way that we do. Is the indie sleaze revival a real thing? Or is it something astroturfed by labels, tastemakers, and the powers that be? Or is it something that culture critics will sit and argue and talk about all day, but the vast majority of people will never even know is a thing? Is it doomed to stay in a certain niche of the internet, or is it just like a immediate post-pandemic fad like NFTs or cottagecore? I don't know. The music's pretty fun, and it makes me feel nostalgic for a time when I was growing up in New York, and when I would go into Manhattan, I felt like I was walking on hallowed ground with all the amazing art that had come out of it in the past 40 or 50 years. Sometimes it doesn't really feel like that anymore. And good music is good music, no matter what label we slap on it now or what label we might slap on it later. So some of the music from this era will live on. Other parts will be forgotten, and some might even be laughed about. But that's a part of the culture cycle. Alright, let me know what you want me to talk about next. Peace.